Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Ghoul Guides Association. You may have been wondering where we've been. We did take a couple weeks off because it was summertime. And yes, goths don't generally go hand in hand with summertime, but it's been one hell of a year. So I
was just going to say, we've been hibernating in our caves, but all right, yeah, fine. You went on holiday.
I did go in a cave, though. Like, I did literally go in a cave because it was really hot. And I was like, let's go to these caves. It's cold in these caves. So technically true. But yeah, we took a much deserved couple weeks break because this has been quite the year. We've had a lot on our respective plates, so we thought, you know what, we've done remarkably well for the last couple of months at making episodes, so let's take a break. We did forget to mention that we were taking a break.
Well, we did, for our avid listeners, our regular listeners, we did mention that we would be taking a break, but then we forgot to mention that anywhere else. So
we also took a longer break than expected.
Yeah.
But, you know, we're back, and we will be coming back with our Promised Witches series, which is our Halloween content. We're going to be talking about the history of witchcraft and its importance to not just the Gothic, but pop culture, and thinking about how the Gothic, you know, bleeds into so many aspects of pop culture. But for this episode, this meeting of the association, we are actually rewind. But for this episode, or this meeting of the association, we are actually going to be doing some book recommendations. We got a message while we were in Dundee actually, for the Gothic Women Conference, which went very well. Thank you to everybody that came. We got a message from one of our listeners, Ollie, on Instagram, who asked if we could recommend some Gothic reading for them. And I showed the message to Mary, and Mary said, we can do that. So here we are.
Here we are.
So what we've decided to do is we are each going to give two recommendations, one from the classic Gothic era. Often we call it like the early Gothic, which is usually considered to be the mid-1700s to the early 1800s, although strong argument to say that much, much earlier literature is Gothic, particularly things like Jacobean revenge tragedies. They're not quite as fun to read as they are to watch, though. So we've gone for novels, I think. I've assumed. I actually don't know. I should have checked with you.
I've gone for you to make that assumption. I guess we'll find out.
We'll find out. Yeah, you very easily could have gone for something else. But yeah, we've both gone for a classic Gothic text and a more modern Gothic text. And we might have a bit of an honourable mentions at the end, a bit of a chat about how we pick our reading. But we thought, yeah, that's quite a fun episode for our first meeting back. So, Dr. Mary Misgoing, what is your first Gothic recommendation, if you please?
Okay, so my first one, I am going classic. And also, I have to apologise and just let you know that I'm cheating here, and you're going to be getting a 2-for-1 kind of in this recommendation. But first of all, this will surprise no one, and I do have the books to hand. So if you are watching on YouTube, be prepared for the book covers as well.
I didn't think to get the books out. To be fair, all my books are in storage because I currently don't have my own home, so I'm going to use that excuse.
Yeah, it's hard when you're living in a cave, but we'll let you off.
Thanks.
My first one is Matthew Lewis's The Monk.
I did not foresee this outcome.
So if you have studied the Gothic, or if you listen to us, and this won't be a surprise, and you'll be thinking, oh no, this again. But like for everyone who maybe doesn't read kind of early Gothic texts, and if you like, this is what I would say your quintessential, you must read this. This is really great. And I think as well, what I like about it is that some of the like early Gothic texts, when we read them like from, you know, as contemporary readers, they can be a bit long and overly complicated, whereas this novel, so much happens in it, like you will be, I think it shocks even readers today. So yeah, just I guess a little bit of discussion about it. Matthew Lewis wrote this when he was 18. He wrote it in a couple of weeks, which I think also adds to it being just completely batshit. He was inspired by Anne Radcliffe, who is, you know, the great enchantress of Gothic literature, although she was horrified.
She literally wrote a clapback.
Yeah, she was horrified by his novel and did not like what he had written. But basically, it has, I guess, two kind of plots. So the main plot follows Ambrosio, who is the monk, the eponymous monk, and he is kind of holier than thou. And this is set in Spain, in, I guess, a little bit in the past, as Gothic novels tended to do in that period. And he is this kind of holier than thou monk who everyone travels from across Spain to kind of listen to his preachings. Obviously, there was no Netflix in those days, so if you wanted to be entertained, sermons is a kind of good place to gather. And also, if you just wanted to hang out with loads of people, then, you know, the kind of after sermon crowd was very buzzing.
Yeah, man, it was popping off.
But obviously, you know, what does this have to do with the Gothic? Well, if you are the devil, and you're thinking, and you're seeing this person who claims to be like the, you know, the most holy, the most pure, you're going to think, great, challenge accepted. Let's tempt this guy. And that is essentially what the main plot is about. So yeah, I won't give too much away, but I will say that the devil does feature in it at some point. And also in the kind of secondary narrative, there is also, probably, I was thinking about this the other day, my like best, like what is my favorite ghost? It's in this novel.
Your number one ghost.
My number one ghost, and that is the Bleeding Nun.
The Bleeding Nun.
And is literally the ghost of a woman who is dressed as a nun. She is an atheist. She is a murderer. And she also really loves to have sex. So, you know, I just think she's fabulous. Things also to mention about this book, not only did Radcliffe hate this book and specifically Lewis's portrayal of Ambrosio, loads of other people hated this book as well, so much so that it was debated in Parliament. So yes, I am being a bit of a basic bitch in choosing Matthew Lewis as the monk, but it is so good, and it's got everything that you want. It's got sex, it's got murder, it's got incest, it's got the devil, everything. Now, as I mentioned, I am being sneaky. This is a 2-for-1. So I'm also going to recommend, as a kind of continuation of this.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, Anne Radcliffe's The Italian. So this was written very, very quickly after The Monk was published. You'll notice the similarities in the titles, The Monk and The Italian. And this features Radcliffe's, as you say, clapback to Lewis, the kind of the title figure, the kind of antagonist in it is a monk called Shadoni, who is basically, Radcliffe is like, I hate everything that you've done with Ambrosio. He's awful. I'm going to show you how to write an evil monk. So yeah, it's basically, there's no supernatural in this book, so this isn't a spoiler. The devil doesn't feature in this book, but that's kind of on purpose, so you can see, you know, what Radcliffe is doing in there. So I would definitely check those out. And also, actually, just to be extra sneaky, because I have been really sneaky, this is actually a 3-for-1. This is a 3-for-1. I'm so sorry.
All the rules.
I've broken all the rules. Because I'm also going to recommend to you Zafloya. by Charlotte Dacre.
I nearly picked Zafloya and I didn't because I thought it might be on your list. And then I was thinking to myself, I could have picked Zafloya. Bitch. Yes.
I'm so sorry, but also this is a 3-for-1. I just like sharing Gothic recommendations. But yeah, so this so The Monk was published in 1796. I think The Italian was published in 1797 or quite soon after then. Yeah. Zafloya was published in 1806. And it's written by another woman writer called Charlotte Dacre. And unlike Radcliffe, Charlotte Dacre absolutely loves The Monk. She loves Matthew Lewis. She likes all the characters in it. And she even creates a kind of pen name for herself, Rosa Matilda, which is based on one of the characters from The Monk. And this is, again, her version of The Monk. So I think these are the same kind of novel. It's all kind of variations.
It's kind of like a 3-course meal. Like,
I like that. Yeah.
There's definitely a benefit to reading these 3 in tandem to each other, because one thing that I do love about these 3 novels in combination is that they really, really challenge 2 big things that the Gothic has often fallen foul of, which is this essentializing of the idea of the female Gothic, but also of the Gothic as being anti-Catholic.
Yeah.
Because these 3 novels in succession of each other, they really complicate this very binary concept that there is a male Gothic and a female Gothic, and that the Gothic is always very anti-Catholic, very pro-Protestant, very anti-superstition. Because when Radcliffe claps back, she kind of rejects her own previous seeming anti-Catholicism and says, no, it's more complicated than that. These people aren't evil because they're Catholic. They're evil because within this system there is corruption, and within this system bad people have been able to have corruption, because there are good Catholic characters that I would say are not honorary Protestants in that novel, but there's also the fucking Spanish Inquisition. And then obviously with Dacre you get this complete deconstruction of the idea that when women write Gothic it's something very different to when men write Gothic.
Yeah, I love Zafloya because I like you, and I think like quite a lot of us, I'm really irritated by these kinds of terms of, these binary terms like male Gothic and female Gothic, because I think they're essentializing in a way that is unnecessary and also not true. Yeah, and I think 100%. what you get with Zafloya is something that is so similar to what you get in Lewis, in that it's drawing on that kind of lasciviousness, that horror, that physicality and fleshliness and that grossness almost, and carnality. That you maybe don't get in the same way in Radcliffe. Yeah. But then there were also lots of men writers who wrote like Radcliffe did. So it's like, I think maybe these terms are
that in a moment. So actually, cool. I guess
one thing just to finish on with Zafloya is like, as I said, like it's very much in the kind of like Matthew Lewis Monk school of thought. And if you get this far, if you read The Monk and then you read the Italian and you finish the Italian and you're like, that was great, but I wish there was the devil. Zafloya has you covered because she puts the devil back in.
Yeah, she reintroduces you to the devil.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you are new to the Gothic and you're listening to this because you're like, I would like some Gothic recommendations. When we talk about male and female Gothic, we're talking about this very outdated idea that women only wrote a certain type of Gothic that we now tend to call terror Gothic, because there are 2 distinct genres. They obviously overlap and they speak to each other. But there's this idea that when women write Gothic, it's, the black veil's never fully lifted, and there's only ever the threat of violence, and there's only ever, maybe this bad thing could happen, and it's all about sensibility and heroes and heroines. And then when men wrote Gothic, it's violent and it's sexual and it's horror Gothic. And that is not the case. There are plenty of authors in both camps, and also, of course, that just kind of reconstructs the gender binary and the idea that there are only there's only two types of Gothic and there's only two genders. And from the earliest of Gothic, that has not been the case. There has never been two types of Gothic and there's never been two genders. And I think we are, as not only an academic community, but as a pop culture community and a culture, we're very much moving away from that. But if you've not heard those terms before, that's what we're talking about when we say male and female Gothic, and that's why we don't like those terms. And the book I'm about to recommend will further cement the fact that they're a bit useless, because my recommendation is Francis Latham's The Midnight Bell, which was published in 1798, so around the same time. And Latham potentially knew Lewis. Society at this point is quite small, particularly literary and political society. So, and if you think about like the landed gentry, like everybody knew each other. But Latham is a really interesting character. He kind of disappears partway through his life and lives in this like remote village up north and kind of leaves public society. I'm not going to go too into why that possibly is, because we don't have a lot of biographical information. And whilst I think sometimes it's very positive to talk about the potentials of an author's sexuality, when we have so little about how they identified, and there's also potentially some very unpleasant stuff that happens to Latham, I wouldn't feel right kind of saying like, oh, this is definitely a gay author. What I will say is this is definitely an author that is very interested in, even in 1798, deconstructing ideas of gender and sexuality. Now, The Midnight Bell, you might recognize the name because it's one of the horrid novels in Jane Austen's list in Northanger Abbey. So it appears alongside things like The Orphan of the Rhine by Eleanor Sleeth and novels by Eliza Parsons. And it's very much, a couple of the novels on that are, they're not actually German Gothic because they're not by German writers. One of them is. One of them pretends to be and it's not. But there was this trend towards the late 1790s of German Gothic. German Gothic was a bit darker. It did delve a little bit deeper into ideas of things like incest, but incest where, an uncle is trying to marry his niece because of political power, and the way that people can abuse relationships to take away someone's agency and things like that. So like in The Orphan of the Rhine, I think it is.
Also very, the German kind of tradition was obsessed with secret societies, or the way that secret societies were perhaps influencing governments and politics, but also Faust and those kinds of like the influence of the devil and those kinds of deals and stuff. So we think of stuff like Goethe. He was writing Faust in this kind of period, and you have lots of like kind of German authors. Schubert's another really good example, and who wrote the Armenian? I forget, but I'm
not very good with my names on the German authors.
The author of the Armenian is also really good example of this kind of this German school.
It's very it shares a lot of similarities with the British school, and actually the British school starts to appropriate things out of it, which is why we get this sudden burst of novels like Castle Wolfenbach, like Orphan of the Rhine, like Midnight Bell, that are set in Germany. Because Germany is still quite an interesting place at this point. It's not a country, really. It's, lots of different country states. And if you think about it in context of the Napoleonic Wars, 1798, we're moving to the end of the Revolutionary Wars. We're approaching Napoleon's coup. It's a falling empire at this point in time.
I will also say, like Matthew Lewis, again, friends with your author, but also, friends with like the Shelleys and Byron and all this kind of stuff. He essentially became like a kind of foreign ambassador because he spoke so many languages, and he spent quite a long period in Germany. And I think even the period before he published The Monk, he was in Germany, and some of the bits in The Monk like the Bleeding Nun, are taken from German legends and folklore. And actually, just as a fun fact, he translated Goethe's Faust for Byron because he spoke German fluently. And sometimes in like England, if you didn't speak German, you couldn't read German, then you couldn't understand or read these texts. Byron couldn't, but Byron knows Faust because Lewis read it to him.
So the Midnight Bell is very much in this Germanic tradition. It doesn't do what some of the texts at this point of time did, which was pretend to be a translation. Because the German Gothic reintroduced the translation trope because not a lot of people could speak German because French had been the language. We were now at war with France. France is inaccessible. Germany was accessible. So all of a sudden, it's also on and off. I won't go into the complicated politics of all the many wars of the coalitions, of which I think there were 7 or 8. But at this point, Prussia, the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic states, largely are Britain's allies. So there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of trade. So the Midnight Bell doesn't do the kind of found manuscript thing. But what it does do, really interestingly, is pick up the Radcliffean Gothic. So Latham, this male author, is writing very much in the female Gothic, so to speak. And this is a weird book. So this is one of those where, like, I love this book. It's not well written. And you might be thinking, Lauren, we've asked you for recommendations for some of your favourite or best Gothic books. Why are you recommending this book? It's still a great book because when you read it thinking about like what's going on with the Gothic, what's going on in the context of Europe, this book is fascinating. So the protagonist, Adolphus, is this kind of lost young man who's been displaced, who is kind of wandering across Europe, who, you know, maybe his uncles killed his dad, he doesn't know. And you as the reader, you're like, is this a Hamlet story? There's a ghost, you know, potentially. And at one point, he's a soldier. And you have this very interesting relationship with his Italian commander that I think you can really read through not even just a homoerotic lens. It's doing something very interesting as well with just male friendships and
homosocial
male homosocial relationships that the earlier sentimental novels definitely do, and I think the Italian does do this as well. You do have, but not always. It's often a master-servant friendship. It's not often two men who would like die for each other, so to speak. So he has this really close relationship with his Italian commander, and the Italian is important because at this point in time, Italy is seen as being this, you know, hot-blooded, salacious, exotic place. He finishes his career in the army, the war ends. He ends up working in a mine. When he's working in the mine, a nobleman comes to visit the mine, and the nobleman's servant, who the nobleman is like, this is my servant, he's served me for 20 years, he's my best friend, falls down the man, dies. And then he's like, I'll be your servant. And what's really interesting about this is then the nobleman dies about 2 pages later. Death in this novel happens very quickly. It happens without pomp. It happens without any real... It's very much like... It's a very interesting look at how death figures in narratives. And when you think about a wartime novel, the frequency of death and the way that death is responded to as just kind of like an unfortunate part of life sometimes is really interesting.
What I do love about books of this period that maybe aren't as polished as, say, a Radcliffe or even a Lewis is that you can still enjoy the narrative. And so just as an aside, I've been watching all of the Omen films. And the first 3, which a lot of people, you know, think of them as a trilogy, they're great. The pacing's quite slow, but it's just because, you know, they were made in the 70s, the 80s, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The fourth one was a TV movie, and it feels like that because the pacing is so fast, so much happens. The editing is so different from the other three, and you can just really get that feel of like the pacing and the narrative is different, and in some ways that makes it bad. But that doesn't mean that it's not enjoyable. So I think, like, with some of these like early Gothic texts that, you know, aren't as necessarily well written, you can still enjoy them, and having these like ridiculous things happen. Like, I remember one book that I was reading, and it's like the protagonist has just got married and he's taking his wife to another city, and then suddenly en route she sticks her head out of the carriage and then it topples over and then she dies. and then it's like, oh, okay, are we just moving on? But it's very much that kind of like telling over TV movie that you can still like enjoy, even if you're like, this is so odd.
It has this really interesting, so the thing that I really enjoy about this novel is I think it does something very interesting with masculinity, which is of course why I was drawn to it. But for the most part, Adolphus is the main character. It does switch focus later on to the woman that he marries. I'm not going to spoil the plot because it is quite convoluted. It also has a potential secret society. It includes escaping the Bastille. There's all sorts of stuff going on. And there's some very strange and interesting things going on with gender, class, race, criminality, heritage. But Adolphus is like, he's useless. But he's not useless. Like, he's a talented soldier, he's a good worker, but he's kind of just like can't find his way, can't find his place. When he does get married, he you know, because of circumstances outside of his control, he can't protect his wife. He then falls sick. Like, all of these things happen to him. And it's a very interesting kind of look at a hero who is just kind of like
a lost soul.
Yeah, like, he's not useless in the way
puppy.
Yeah, he's not useless in the way that Valancourt is useless, where you're like, oh my god, fuck up, Valancourt. He's useless in this way of like, the world has told me I'm meant to do a certain job and be a certain way, but I've been displaced and nobody has given me the tools or the direction that I need. Like, I've kicked out of my home before I finished maturing. And now I'm out in the world and I don't know what the world expects of me. And every time I try to do something that the world expects of me, something happens or it goes wrong. And I have to then find something else, like, outside of my control, which I think is a really interesting take on masculinity at a time where so many young men are going off to war. They're coming back injured, or they're coming back and they're like, well, I can't be a farmhand anymore because I watched people die, but also I've been trained to do this. So, you know, I no longer fit into my society, but my society's told me I have a rightful role, and then it's taken away from me. So from that perspective, it's really great. The other thing is, of course, as it must, it has another internal narrative. So within the text, you have the hermit's narrative. So the heroine is kidnapped by this local lord who's like really jealous and wants to have her. She manages to escape. She ends up at this hermit's house. When I say house, it's like a cave. It's literally a mossy cave. And he tells her this really interesting story about how he came to be a hermit. And again, I don't want to spoil it because it is a really interesting story, but there's some really fascinating gender and sexuality stuff that goes on within that narrative, but also within the way that the narrative's told, because it's the male hermit telling the narrative to this young woman. And then the power and dynamic in the novel kind of shifts from that point on. It's just a great text. It's not that long. I think you can get it for free on Kindle, or you can buy it from Valancourt Press. And because you picked more than one, I will say, if you read it and enjoy it, I would also recommend getting the other, well, I say the other, quite a lot of novels were published in 1798. 1798 was one of the most prolific years for Gothic publishing. But the other one I would recommend alongside it, and I have recommended this before, is Regina Maria Roche's Claremont, because that also does something not quite as extreme as Dacre, but whereas Francis Latham is writing in a very, I would say, female Gothic way, as we would expect, and therefore that deconstructs challenges and basically proves the binary to be useless. That is one of the most shocking, violent novels within that Radcliffean Gothic genre I've ever read. It's got murder, it's got spousal abuse, it's got familial backstabbing and double crossing. The servant is not who they say they are and is not to be trusted, and there's all of this strange stuff going on, and the violence very much is present. The heroine manages to avoid a lot of it, but it's there in the text, and the people she loves and she respects and cares about have seemingly done terrible things. And it's such an anxious novel because she doesn't, the main character Madeline, she doesn't know what's going on. She can't find out the truth because everything's hidden from her. So you don't know it either. And it's a really claustrophobic, anxious novel. It doesn't do the Radcliffean thing where she's looking over, top down. And often, like in Udolpho, we know where Valancourt is. We know that this thing is happening. We know that Emily is going to be safe. There's things that are hinted, or we get a second perspective. While this was happening to this character. You don't get that in Claremont. You are standing behind Madeline the entire time. And it's just such a worrying, anxious novel. So many terrible things happen, but it's not it's been dismissed as a Radcliffean imitator. I really don't think it is. I think it's very, very well written. And I actually think even though all these terrible things happen, they're all fucking believable. They are all things. There's a couple of bits where you're like, would that happen? But there's this whole thing about jealousy between two brothers, one of whom is illegitimate, one of whom is legitimate. There's, a woman who is multiple people tricked into false marriage. A lot of the things that happen are super believable. It's a great Gothic novel. But yeah, if you're interested in the fact that even in 1798 people were rejecting this idea of there being gendered Gothic in that negative way, those two novels go really nicely together. So yeah, Francis Latham's The Midnight Bell and Regina Maria Roche's Claremont, in my opinion, the two best novels of 1798.
And I will just say now, excellent choices, obviously. If you read any of these books that we recommend and you enjoy them, then let us know.
Yeah.
But also, if you have any, just while we take a little pause after our early Gothic period, if you have any early Gothic texts that you think this is a great novel and more people should read it, then comment on wherever, YouTube, Twitter,
there should
whatever
be
podcast.
On Spotify, I think you can ask a question, tick.
Yeah.
So
yeah, please do send us your recommendations as well.
Yeah. Or you can, as we've said, contact us via seance. Sometimes the signal's a bit faulty. If it doesn't work, you can always send us an email.
As a backup.
Yeah, maybe just let us know.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so moving away from the classique period, what's your... I was going to say contemporary.
I guess this would count as contemporary. It's not. I decided not to go for a 21st century novel.
I've also not
this is a
novel.
Yeah, this is a text that is written in the 20th century. But it's one of my absolute favorites. And I just think that it is. I just think everyone should read it, basically. So, and also, don't worry, I've just got one text. I'm not gonna do a switch on you. So I am recommending, again, apologies for everyone listening, but if you are watching on YouTube, you can have a look at the cover. Octavia Butler's Kindred. So yeah, Octavia Butler's Kindred, which was published in 1979. So I love Octavia Butler. I think everything that she writes is amazing. But I really love this book because I think it's a really interesting kind of Gothic-y, sci-fi time travel thing that you maybe might not be expecting. And obviously, as we know, like, you know, Gothic, fantasy, sci-fi, they all have strong roots in women's writers. Yeah. And I also think that it's just great to think, you know, when we talk about early Gothic texts, we're often like speaking about like white authors, and it's nice. Obviously, there are contemporary authors who were writing Gothic who were not white. But I think one thing that, like, especially when you move into like the 20th and 21st century, in terms of like the mainstream, there's more kind of texts that are written by Black authors and you know, other kinds of groups that I think just really enriches like the Gothic. And yeah, I like Kindred because I think it does something really interesting with time travel.
Yeah.
So I don't really want to spoil it, but I guess I'm going to have to spoil it a little bit. But basically the premise of it is we have the main character, Dana, who is kind of in the contemporary 1970s period. She is Black, and her partner is white, and he's Kevin. And suddenly she starts experiencing like this kind of dizziness, and then she ends up in basically antebellum Maryland, which was during the period of slavery, and she's there, and you know, she keeps having these periods where she's time traveling, essentially. She goes dizzy, she time travels back in time, which I think more people need to explore. You know, time travel, we often think about, you know, going forwards. Obviously, there is a classic Back to the Future, whatever. But like, I think...
And a baby.
But I think, you know, it's I think more people should explore going back in time, and especially, you know, periods that we might not necessarily think of in terms of time travel. She goes back and she genuinely experiences what it's like to be an enslaved person.
A lot of particularly women's writing, and again, I want to be really clear that this is not to say that romance is anyway a lesser genre, but a lot of women's writing, when it does use time travel, it often is in more of the romance genre. And often the romance genre and the Gothic genre have massive overlaps, and complement each other very, very well. They kind of come from the same genesis. And romance, Gothic, like things like Outlander, do acknowledge the dangers of when you know, if you as a Wonder Woman were to go back in time, these are the dangers you would face. But it is often through a romance lens, and it is also often very white. And the thing that I really loved about Kindred is it makes you anxious as a reader because of what it does with time travel.
Yeah.
As well as using it to tell... A lot of slavery narratives that we get are very like either white saviory, or they're, you know, to make white people go, oh, that was so terrible. Like, and that's not to say that I'm not part of that. Like, I definitely used to watch things like The Help and be like, what a beautiful story. You know, you don't realize necessarily until you start to check your privilege, but just as a reading experience, that novel made me feel so anxious in that way that you're like, oh, I loved the way this made me feel.
I think what's interesting about it is that in the same way that quite a lot of Toni Morrison's works have a lot of horror in them, but the horror is you know, focused on Black bodies. This is the real horror of slavery, and I think you get that in Kindred, where it's like, this is the horror that Dana is both a witness to, but also then experiences. So she goes back, and then she goes backwards and forwards, and she can't control her time travel, and she goes back, and basically it's all centered on her ancestors, who you learn, one of which is a kind of he starts off as a boy, but he is essentially a slave owner, a master, and he is white. And then one of the enslaved women on the plantation, who is Black. So you have Rufus and Alice, and she is connected to Rufus and periods where his life is in danger. So it's almost like she's connected to him, and before I guess her ancestry is kind of established, and there's a lot of kinds of questions and anxieties, what do I do here, which you find in loads of time travel stuff. Should I change the past that will have irrevocably, will it irrevocably change?
I can't remember what the paradox is called, but there's a paradox in kind of like theoretical time travel science and writings about sort of meeting your own ancestors, and would you cease to exist, and what would happen to you, and all of this kind of stuff. And then Kindred does a really good job as well of then using that to flip the it's not the white savior thing, it's not quite white. Is it White Knight? Like, you feel sympathy at first for Rufus, and you kind of think, oh, he's gonna be like the one good guy that is just a victim of his society, and then he's really, like, not to be a spoiler, but this book is not rose tinted.
It also, it's not rose tinted. I don't think you can do that, but it doesn't necessarily have a happy ending. It has an ending. It's not exactly happy, but then it's also one of these things that it's very real. But it's kind of like, no, we can't change the past. Let's look to the future. Which I guess is one of, time travel, and it's also what the Gothic does. But the Gothic has always been really interested in kind of time and these like kind of temporal and geographical kind of distances. And I think that's what makes this novel really interesting, is that like you do have, she's basically, without being able to control it, she is thrown both to a different geographical space, but also to a different temporal space. And she just has to deal with it.
Which is it's in of itself is such a clever and scary like convention, because usually when we have superpowers, which obviously like the superhero genre, but also within the Gothic, like we have a lot of like the Jean Grey narrative of can't control the power. But usually that is like the power is too big, or it needs to be controlled with, and it's often tropes around self-control and around self-knowledge, and it's not usually that you will be accidentally putting yourself in danger. It's like you're going to hurt the people around you. This totally rejects that, and it's kind of like, it's not necessarily a power, it's not necessarily a gift, it's just this horrible fucking thing that keeps happening to you, and you can't really work out, like,
I think that's such a good way.
So scary.
It just keeps happening to you, and I think that is why this is such a good time travel book, because it's like, what if you're not in control of your past, you're not in control of where you've been, and sometimes you're not even in control of where you're going,
or how you came to be.
I read it knowing that it was a time travel book about antebellum slavery, but when I read it, I was just completely blown away, and it's so well written, and it's just so interesting and fascinating and horrifying. But I think
it's a good book.
It's a good book. And
I also would say, if you are a sci-fi fan, her sci-fi, particularly like her short stories, are really, really good. Some of them, I think she's a bit like Toni Morrison, not to essentialize, because not to be like, oh yeah, these two black authors are the only two people talk about, but like Toni Morrison, I think the Gothic really informs a lot of Butler's writing, in terms of she's like, okay, I'm going to use this as a linchpin that all of you motherfuckers are going to understand when you read it, and then I'm going to do something like different with it. Her sci-fi is really, really good. I really enjoy it, and some of it makes you go, and
I also think that sometimes like sci-fi and fantasy are often co-opted. And it's like sci-fi and fantasy can only mean, or can only be good when it's written by men or written for men. And I think that this is a really good example, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, of women writing sci-fi, but also the interconnections of sci-fi and Gothic, and that how these have always been open to women, and also to to other kinds of groups, to Black women, and any basically these things are not just for white
I
men.
think if you are someone who likes the Gothic potentiality and the way that Gothic like makes potential an anxious thing, then looking for sci-fi, starting with things like Shelley's short stories, going into things like The Island of Dr. Moreau, into things like Butler. There's some really, really upsetting, in a good way, Japanese and Korean science fiction short stories.
Yeah.
And more recently, things like Sylvia Moreno Garcia, she does this kind of thing. And N.K. Jemisin. She has a series called Broken Earth that does this very similar type of thing where it's like just familiar enough that you're like, okay, I'm in, I get it, you don't need to lore dump on me, but then unsettling and weird enough that you're like, oh no, what's happening? I don't like it. But in that way that, that's why we read Gothic and watch horror movies. Oh yeah, I love that novel. Good pick.
Thank you.
I now am going to be a massive hypocrite because I gave you shit for picking 3 books and I'm about to recommend 3 books.
Oh wow, it's all coming out now, isn't it?
Listen, mine are all by the same author and they're a trilogy.
Okay, well,
technically they're not all by the same author because I'll get to that. Before I moved into the cave, those of you that watch on YouTube might remember that there was a portrait of a man behind me who looked very intense, and that man was Mervyn Peake. And my recommendation is the Ghoul Guides trilogy.
I am shocked.
I know, I bet you could never see this coming.
I do have to confess, though, I still have not read.
Well, this is why I haven't. Let me redo that. So this is why I wanted to recommend them, because actually, as much as in a way they are very popular and they are, I would say, part of the canon, they're still on the more unknown side. They're still on the more niche side. I feel like they had a brief surge of popularity again in the early 2010s when there was an anniversary. And if you too were a college-aged, university-aged student in the late noughties and early 2010s here in the UK, then you might remember the singer Jack Pignate, who is the grandson of Mervyn Peake. I love that fact because I liked them both. But yeah, I actually don't think Gormenghast is as well known as I sometimes think it is, which is why I decided to recommend it, because I was like, well, maybe people aren't aware of it. So this... And
you mean this isn't just part of your crusade to get me to read them?
It's my crusade to get everyone to read them, Mary. Because I am a Mervyn Peake super fan. I wrote my undergrad dissertation on Mervyn Peake. I don't know if you can see, if you are on YouTube, just here. This is a Folio Society edition that I just picked up in an Oxfam bookstore in Bath. I will not say how much they were because my mum will be listening. They weren't that expensive, Mum. That are illustrated, and actually not by him, but he also was an illustrator. So Peake actually was raised in China for his early life. His parents were, his dad was a doctor, and they were missionaries, which is always a little bit icky, but they were more medical missionaries than religious missionaries. He had a very interesting childhood, growing up in this increasingly international metropolitan area of China. They then left and came back to England, and he studied art, and he was friends with people like Dylan Thomas. He met his wife Maeve, and he for a while was the artist in residence for the Isle of Sark. He illustrated things like Alice in Wonderland. He did a Treasure Island. He did a version of The Hunting of the Snark. He also did a version of Jabberwocky. These very dark, weird line illustrations. But he was originally a painter. And essentially Peake applied to be a war artist. So in the Second World War, he was a war artist. And what he was mostly interested in was destruction. He saw a lot of these ruined streets in Germany of wounded people and soldiers, and that really massively affected him. So he comes back and he writes a novel called Titus Grown. So Titus Groan is the first one in the series, and Gormenghast is the castle. So Gormenghast is this huge, sprawling, endless Gothic castle, and the Groans are the family within the castle. And the novel is essentially about when ritual becomes pointless. So they have all of these things that the Earl of Gormenghast, so Titus Groan, it starts with him being born, he's the heir to Gormenghast, and they have to do all of these bizarre rituals. And nobody knows why they do these bizarre rituals, but that's what's done, so they do them. No one questions it. And the setting is just so strange, and you can tell that it's very inspired by his very like eclectic upbringing, his time at art school, his time away, his time as a war artist. And essentially, it's a story about this family and the downfall of this family. So there's a character called Steerpike. He is a kitchen boy. He's this very strange kind of like, you know, angular young man. He's played by Jonathan Rhys-Davies, I think, is the guy from Ben and Like Beckham, and who played Henry in The Tudors, in the BBC adaptation, which I think you will be able to find places because it was BBC One. And he is a kitchen boy, and he basically doesn't want to be a kitchen boy, but he has to be a kitchen boy because everybody has a role, and that's your role, and you do your role. And he's like, no, I'm smart, I'm ambitious, and he starts to claw his way up, and like he's like, I'm gonna, you know, ingratiate myself into society. He befriends Titus's older sister Fuchsia, who is a Gothic heroine, but an unfulfilled Gothic heroine with no chance to actually ever leave her castle. He like ingratiates himself with Titus's aunts. He basically becomes like an advisor within the castle, and him and Titus kind of eventually have this kind of face off. The castle, you know, floods, all these things happen. And it's sort of like a big Gothic rejection of pointless ritual for no reason, legacy and lineage for no reason, about how you find yourself and how you deconstruct. And I think in some ways it does hark back to things like The Monk, because The Monk is essentially a novel about the downfall of a cult leader. Ambrosio is this adored priest. Everybody's hanging on his every word. He's got nobody to tell him no or rein him in. And there's that whole thing about like he should have been a soldier. If he'd have been a soldier, all of these passions would have been productively channeled, but instead he becomes a monk, and that means that he goes down this path that leads him to corruption and abuse of power, and that's kind of what Gormenghast is about. But in terms of novels that paint visual pictures, you will never read anything like this. I've never read anything and gone, this reminds me of Gormenghast. Like, it's such an amazing novel. So it is a series of 3, and actually the last one, so Peake had Parkinson's disease. And in the 40s and 50s and 60s, not very well treated. And unfortunately, during the time he was writing the last novel, Titus Alone, he got more and more unwell and very sadly passed away. So Titus Alone is kind of a semi-unfinished novel. It is finished, but it's kind of a bit gappy. And then about 10 years ago, they found out that his wife, Maeve, had like, who helped him a lot with his writing and helped him. She was also an artist. She had kind of like rewritten it and like sort of finished it,
yeah,
but decided not to publish it. And then the family decided to publish it. So there is actually 4 novels, but it depends which one you choose to read for the last one. But yeah, that's my recommendation. It will always be my recommendation. It's my favorite books.
If you, I mean, I think it's great, and I love how passionate you are about Gormenghast, and it's just every time you talk about them, I learn something new about what you love about them, which is always nice. I like learning about my friends' passions.
Oh, friend.
Yeah, but I mean, what I will say is, if you've enjoyed this, and if you want us to do more recommendation stuff, then we will be less basic.
Yeah, we'll start. I was like, do I recommend La Vie Vampire? Like, one of the fucking weirdest books I've ever read. But I was like, no, we've been asked for reading recommendations. I'm going to do some good, solid ones.
But I think that's good. It's nice. Also, it's also nice to have a trilogy, because then, like, if you enjoy the first one, then you can carry on, and if you don't, then that's okay. You've read the first one. You don't.
Yeah, exactly. There's also a short story called The Boy in Darkness that kind of goes with Gorman Gas. That if you are a sci-fi Dr. Moreau fan, there's some weird animal shit going on in that book. Liked that one a lot. But yeah, that's my recommendation. I feel like we've had quite a mixed bag here, but also a lot of complimentary stuff. I mean, I know we said we might do honorable mentions, which I think maybe we can still, but if you were to say, like, in terms of the way you pick your books, like, if you see something on a blurb, like a Gothic trope or convention, and you see it on a blurb, like, what's the one that makes you go, I'm going to read that?
So I really love spooky shit. I think if you had to describe, like, what I'm interested in, like, just as a catch-all, like, I love stuff that's spooky. I love watching spooky things. I like reading spooky things. I like having, like, my aesthetic, the stuff, like the things that I buy.
Yeah.
I like them to be a little bit spooky. And I guess by extension, what I quite like is, I guess, stuff that melds into the supernatural. So supernatural and monsters and things, and what is something doing that's different. I enjoy stuff like Radcliffe, but I think for me, the thing that I really enjoy is, let's see how we can push the boundaries of fiction and imagination. Let's throw the devil in. Let's throw a ghost in. Let's do time travel. Let's have this, like, vampire. Like, I really enjoy the supernatural, and the way that trope is used differently in Gothic.
I mean, we both really like Poppy Z. Bright, who is a great example of pushing the boundaries of what the Gothic can do, which makes sense. Yeah, you like the kind of, like, the continuation of the snowball. Like, what's the next experimentation or mutation?
Yes, that's another good thing that I enjoy, the experimentation. I think that's why I like the Gothic. Yeah. And I think it's why I like parts of sci-fi that I find most interesting are the bits that do that. I think for me, one thing that will really put me off a book or a film or something is if it is a bunch of men talking about men things, and it's specifically written for men. Like, I don't know, like, I find that really boring, because I feel like I've read that already, and the stuff that's coming at, whether it's books, whether it's films, there's nothing new. Yes. Whereas, like, when you look beyond that, whether it's to women, white women, women of color, or queer fiction, like, I just think it's like people, it's just more interesting. Yes. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, that was just sense. It's not to say that I don't enjoy stuff written by men or that features men. It's just that it has to be doing something interesting. Yeah. It can't just be like, oh, here's a film. It's one of the reasons why I'm really glad that people have enjoyed Barbie and Oppenheimer. But for me, I'm never ever going to watch Oppenheimer, because it's just doing that thing that I find quite boring, which is that it's about men talking about men making bad choices. I've read that. I've seen that. Like, not interested. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think
I will go and watch Grave of the Fireflies. Thank you very much.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Grave of the Fireflies. I've watched it. It's the only Ghibli film that I won't rewatch, because it's seared into my mind.
Yeah.
I guess what I've realized thinking about that is, like, I really like domestic Gothic. And what I mean by that is, like, I don't want to call it low stakes, because it's not low stakes. For the people in the texts, it's big stakes. But, like, I'm not so interested in stuff like The Stand, which is like, I do like dystopia and, you know, I enjoy playing it and watching it. But within a text, particularly novels, I've realized so as you know, because you were there, I wrote my paper for Gothic Women about the evolution of the Gothic heroine from the Radcliffean Gothic through to more recent texts focusing on Sylvia Moreno Garcia's Mexican Gothic. She's a Mexican-Canadian writer, grew up in Mexico City, I think. Or did she grow up in Monterey? I can't remember. But it's a great text. It's a super claustrophobic, super creepy, plays with your expectations. But it's a domestic text. And I think what I've realized is, like, you know, like Claremont, I love these texts that are set in these houses.
Yeah.
That, like, you know, and the home should be, maybe this is my personal trauma. The home should be this like safe space where like your chosen unit lives within the home, and the home is your safe four walls. And like texts like Mexican Gothic really disrupt that. Like the house itself is dangerous. In Gormenghast, the castle is its own character. Udolpho, the castle, is its own character. And Claremont, the house, has got all these weird things in it. Like, why do you have this in your house as like a countess? And what I've really realized is in a lot of these like more modern texts, I really love stuff where it's like the world continues to turn, but for these like 6 or 7 people within this narrative, something weird is happening. And I think, again, because we went to that great panel on Shirley Jackson, and I love The Haunting of Hill House, but also We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is a really unsettling domestic Gothic. And I was thinking about it and I was like, yeah, I love not necessarily haunted house narratives, although I do, but I love these texts that are like, all of these things are going on. The world is still turning. There's still war. There's still famine. There's still all of these things. But within this, because it almost makes it worse, like it almost makes it scarier. And it also almost makes it kind of like, when you're like, is this happening? And would this happen in our modern world? And I love how modern Gothic, like Mexican Gothic, has managed to reinvigorate that genre and has managed to kind of continue playing with that. And I was thinking that when I was reading another Latin author, Mariana Enriquez. I know we both have read her recently. And I was reading Things We Lost in the Fire. I was thinking, like, particularly the story about the girl who is back in her family home. And Isabel Allende, who is not really a Gothic writer, she's more of a historical romance writer, but she does this too, where you're like, there's this family and this space, and the space is neither good nor evil, but is somehow haunted. And I've realized that I think if I pick something up and it's like, you know, there's this woman and she lives in this house, and the house was owned by her great grandfather, and there's these things, or like, she's got to go back. I love those things where it's like going back to the place you escaped. I'm like, oh, yeah, sign me up. That sounds great.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think ultimately, like, we have different tropes, I guess, that we like, but it's all about people. Like, we're interested in the people, you know, like I'm interested in how people respond to being a monster, or to encountering a monster, or to encountering a ghost, or to encountering the devil. It's all about that kind of, you know, what if you just put the kind of human relationships up to 11, I guess, and a bit of spookiness. How do people interact? And for you, it's like, you know, how do people in a domestic setting, or in a kind of like small, enclosed, intimate setting, not necessarily in relation to like being a house thing, but like just a small community, or like a group of people, how, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's why, as we all know, I'm not a big horror fan, but the things I do like are things like The Shining, Wicker Man, Get Out, these stories that are like, they take place in these confined spaces that are reflective of the world around them. I think because, you know, a lot of my work is like, okay, this fucking huge war is going on.
Yeah.
How, if you're a young woman living in a village in Hampshire, do you deal with that? Because it affects you. You don't get a say about it. You don't get to be present for it. You don't even know if the information that you're getting is true. And that translates over to being, you know, to being a minority, to being in a fake news society. You know, there's all of these things that like really translate over into modern society that I think the Gothic in some of the Gothic texts that have come out in the last few years are so good, because they really dig into that feeling, which is why maybe they're the only horror films I can watch, because nothing gory happens, but like, and some people are like, it's the most fucking terrifying thing I've ever seen, and I'm like, yes, but it's the right type of terrifying for me to enjoy.
Yeah, I know. I guess we have kind of recommended a few more other things, but I just, as like one more honorable mention, just because I feel like it fits with this kind of thing. Like, I guess when what I was saying, what I don't like and what I do like, what I really like is that inventiveness that I think you get in the Gothic. It allows you to take something that is well established and maybe do it differently or put your own take on it. And so my other honorable mention, which I do also have here, which I'm also just going to show you this fabulous book cover that I have.
That's amazing.
So if you can see, this is Octavia Butler again. It's another Octavia Butler book. And this is the book cover, because it came in like a fancy...
it comes in a box.
It comes in a box. So this is Fledgling. And this is one of her vampire texts.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I don't like this as much as I like Kindred. I enjoyed reading this because of its inventiveness. I'm not entirely sold on the way that vampirism is presented, but what is really enjoyable is just the way that it's so different. It's so different, and it reimagines vampires in such a unique way. And I think that's what I really like about, the trope of the supernatural or monsters is, okay, yeah, anyone can write a story with a vampire. What are you doing that's different?
Yes.
And I think someone like Butler, she just writes so well, but she's also it's just so imaginative and inventive.
I think Butler is one of those, and this will be the last thing I say, but I think Butler is in the same vein of people like Angela Carter, and I know I keep mentioning a bit Sylvia Moreno Garcia. I think that's why they're three authors that like I'll read anything they've written, because they get genre.
100%, yeah.
And then that means they can write in any genre. Like, they are three writers who have written in, like, Carter writes everything from fairy tale to weird post-apocalyptic sci-fi. So does Butler, so does Moreno Garcia. Like, they have this ability to that, and I think part of this is, they're very well read, they study literature, like, but they have this amazing skill to understand like what makes genre tick, and they bring you in. They're like, hi, okay, you're aware of the genre, you know how the genre works, cool, I'm gonna totally do something different, but it's familiar enough that you don't need a big lore dump, you don't need a big explanation, I don't need to go into the nitty-gritty of how the science behind these vampires work, because you get it, because you know the genre I'm working in. I'm going to subvert your expectations whilst also fulfilling them, and you're going to close this book and think, shit, that was so enjoyable. They Margaret Atwood does this too. She's a little bit less genre focused, although I mean she writes dystopias. They are authors who I'm like, I pick one of their books up and by dinner time I've finished them. Like, I read Signals to Noise, which is one of Moreno Garcia's novels, when we were on holiday, and I started it in the morning, finished it at night. And Kate was like, have you finished that novel in a day? I was like, bitch, it was really readable. Like, I enjoyed reading it. Like, sometimes I think, that wasn't their best, or like not a literary masterpiece compared to some of them, but damn enjoyable, readable fiction that makes you feel a kind of way.
And on that note, I guess we should say, if you have any books that makes you feel like that you want more people to read, then please do, send us your recommendations or comment or in, seance, whatever, we'll get them. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want more like this, then also let us know, because clearly we like books, and
I think we like known about us.
We like talking about them, so there's loads more that we can recommend.
And if you'd like us to do more deep dives again, like the Ghoul Guide Association has become our main show because the format works. It works for us. It lets us talk about stuff, and just from the way that we make content, it was easier. But that doesn't mean that every now and then an association can't meet to talk about a specific text and how freaking weird it is. If you want me to yell at Mary about a video game for an hour, give me that reason. But in the meantime, you know where to find us over on social media. We are currently still on the sinking ship. We will be there until it becomes paywalled. But we're also over on Instagram. Of course, you can follow us on YouTube and on Spotify and other podcast platforms. We're on Apple Music and on Google Play. And in the meantime, everybody, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.